Welcome to the Baptist Broadcast. Thank you so much for tuning in through iTunes, Spotify. Do not forget to check out the Substack blog article that you can subscribe to. It's joshsummer.substack.com. They're both free and paid options for that. The paid option, of course, helps to make content like this better. If you're watching on YouTube, please do not forget to click the subscribe button down below this video and the bell for continued notifications. If you don't click that bell, you might not get notifications whenever I post new content. So it's always helpful to click that bell. Make sure you get those notifications. I want to respond to two claims that were made, or at least implied or alluded to, in the recent dividing line, where there was a kind of panel discussion between Owen Strachan, Jeff Johnson, and James White. And I don't want to take a whole lot of time to address these claims. This is going to be a short episode, but I just think that it might be helpful to consider some of these things in light of, the historical reality. I think there's a lot of rhetoric going on, and of course it's, both sides are liable to that kind of thing, but it's obviously not always helpful. And I don't mean rhetoric in the technical sense of the art form, but I mean like a lot of conjecture, really. There's a lot of conjecture going on that I don't think is factually accurate, and because it's not factually accurate, I don't think it's obviously helpful. And this comes out a little bit in this panel. I don't want to pick on these guys. I have no desire to go to war with these gentlemen. But I do think it's important to talk about these things, and so this is one of the means by which we can do that. The first claim is made in the video, and I'm sorry, I don't have official timestamps. You'd have to watch it. It's only an hour long. But one of the things that Dr. James White says is, he's asking Dr. Jeff Johnson about, his study of Aquinas over the past 5 years, and says, gosh, something to the effect of, it must have been really soul-destroying, or soul, how is that on the soul, reading Aquinas for that long, implying, of course, it could actually be destructive to the soul to read Thomas Aquinas. That was claim number one. Claim number two has to do with reading Roman Catholic sources in favor of, Reformed and post-Reformed sources, which I don't think is going on. But I think the sentiment behind the claim that Strachan made, that it's a negative aspect of the current movement to read Roman Catholic authors, implying, of course, that we should really not. We should read widely, but really we need to hone in on our own authors, our own tradition, beginning with the Reformation, the anchor of which is always usually seen to be, if you're not talking about the scriptures, obviously, is always seen to be the Institutes. If you want codified Reformed theology, you got to read Calvin's Institutes. Of course, Richard Muller and others have shown that that's just not the case when you're talking about Reformed orthodoxy. You're really not getting to a codified orthodoxy until the 17th century. And that, of course, surpasses Calvin's lifespan. What you get in the Institutes is good theology in a lot of ways. Obviously, there's some things that we Baptists would disagree with, but you do get a mature theology in his latter editions of the Institutes, and it's the theology of a school-trained attorney, right? And a man who loves God and who loves the gospel. And so it's good to read the Institutes, but the Institutes is not the anchor of Reformed orthodoxy. It's just not. It's not the codification of Reformed orthodoxy. The 17th century, really the latter half of the 17th century even, would represent that more developed or more mature Reformed thought, if you're talking about Reformed orthodoxy, okay? But the claim made by Strachan is that it's really a negative aspect of the current ressourcement movement that we would read Roman Catholic authors. Now, So let's look at these claims, piece by piece. We'll just look at the first one. That one is by James White. The implication of what he said to Johnson is that, of course, Thomas Aquinas is unhealthy for the soul. You shouldn't read Thomas Aquinas because that is detrimental to the soul. One of the things we need to be very careful about is to check our own consistency. So, for example, as I just mentioned, Calvin figures heavily into these men's perception of, a well-rounded articulation of Reformed orthodoxy, of Reformed theology, we'll say. But then, Dr. White will make a claim like this. It's unhealthy. The implication of what he said to Johnson is that it's unhealthy to read someone like Thomas Aquinas for that long. I mean, it seems like it would be soul-destroying. How did you get through that? That must have been a very wearying process and a dangerous process indeed. Calvin read Cicero every single year. All right, Calvin read Cicero every single year. I think De Finibus. Don't quote me on that, but I think what he read from Cicero is De Finibus every single year. But you don't have, people looking at that in Calvin saying, man, that must have been really soul destroying, in kind of this way, he's kind of saying that by way of slight, like, oh, the guys who are digging into Aquinas, they're really liable to soul destruction. They're really liable to spiritual damage as a result. And I would just say to that any resource that you read, it doesn't matter how orthodox it is, it doesn't matter how, close to the truth it is, can become soul destroying. I have watched men who love the doctrines of grace, right? But have turned the doctrines of grace, for example, into nothing more than an intellectual exercise. It's an intellectual hamster wheel, is what it is. And they'll get into the canons of Dort, and they'll get into Jonathan Edwards. They'll get into, of course, Calvin and all the the mainstream kind of thinkers historically when it comes to a well-articulated, well-developed understanding of the doctrines of grace. And it's soul-destroying to them, not because of the source, per se, but because of the heart by which they read it, right? Because of the intentionality, because of the reasons, because of the motives that they have for accumulating that kind of intellectual rigor, we might say. And so, regardless of what the source is, you can do great damage to your soul if you approach it, in a way that is not seasoned with grace and for the glory of God. You hear similar objections. I remember whenever I was a student in this fourth and fifth grade, right? This is going back, and I was a student at a private Lutheran school, and Harry Potter had just come out, somewhere around there. And I remember they banned the books. Because there wasn't much known about them at the time. Of course, people hadn't read all the way through them. They didn't know what the motives of the author was. But also there was this underlying, caution because, there's magic in these books. And so we need to ban these books. Meanwhile, in the library, they had all of C.S. Lewis's works. They had The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, of course, and then they had Lord of the Rings, and all sorts of things that include tales of witches and warlocks and alchemy and all sorts of stuff, right? And it was okay for those things to be in the library, but when it came to Harry Potter, which had a lot of the same themes articulated in many ways in the same way as some of those other stories that were perfectly fine in their eyes to keep in the library, Harry Potter was banned. So that's not a consistent. That's just one example of inconsistency, right? And I'm not making a judgment call on the school whether or not that was right or wrong to do. Again, there was little known about what those books were going to have in them, and so there was a great deal of caution. And maybe today they have those books in the library. I don't know. But that's just one example of inconsistency, right? That's inconsistency. You're gonna have books about Gandalf, the gray, and Gandalf the white, in your library, but you're gonna banish books about little Harry Potter going to magic school and all that. So, I mean, it just doesn't comport, right? It doesn't make common sense to do something like that. There's some of the same thing is going on here in terms of methodology. The methodology that's proposed by the three men in this interview is to, essentially what I got out of it is to, read the Reformers, drink more deeply from the Reformers than you would from pre-Reformed sources, which would largely be Roman Catholic in terms of what we have extant today. And don't drink too deeply from the Romans, right? The Romish papacy or anything like that. Stay away from that. Read widely, read some of them, develop your understanding of them so that you can know what the Reformers were reacting to, but in large part really dig into the Reformers and everything that came afterwards. But that's not the historical theological method that the Reformers themselves were using. So here we're having a promotion of the Reformers. Read the Reformers. But we don't. And then a denial really of the Reformers' own methodology. Because what's being said here is start at the Reformation. Don't read beyond. Don't read past that in terms of going back in history, unless you're reading Augustine or somebody like that. But read the Reformers, and that's just a complete denial of the method of someone like John Calvin, who is reading Cicero every year. And he's not just reading Cicero, because there are allusions to other Greek pagan philosophers, especially in the first book of his Institutes. So he's not only reading Cicero, he's reading others. And so, Dr. White or anyone else, if Calvin was sitting in that room with him, he would have to ask him the same question. Oh, it must really be soul destroying to read men like that. It must be dangerous to the soul, right? To read men like that. But I have a feeling that, I don't think that question would be asked. I mean, I could be corrected, of course, if I'm wrong there, but I think it's generally accepted that Calvin read Cicero every year, that Calvin interacted sometimes positively with Roman Catholic theologians because he was reading Roman Catholic theologians. He started out theological life as a Roman Catholic. If you're talking about his religious life, he came out of Roman Catholicism. So, of course, he was reading Roman Catholics. That's in the background of his life. That's biographical for John Calvin. So you can't separate him entirely from Roman Catholics in terms of bibliography, because he's soaked into that milieu of the 16th century. It's just, there's no getting around it. There's no getting away from it. It's pervasive in the thought of the first generation reformers, the second generation reformers, and the post Reformation era of the Puritans. It's absolutely pervasive. And there are specific things that are rejected by the reformers that are found in Roman Catholicism. There are other things that aren't rejected by the reformers. Doctrine of the Trinity is largely retained. A leveled understanding of natural theology and man's knowledge of natural theology, even unregenerate man, is retained. An employment of the theistic proofs is retained demonstrably in the first generation of reformers, and that goes for Calvin and others. And so that's just the first claim that I wanted to look at in this interview. There's a kind of incongruity here, between the method being proposed by these men and the method employed by the men whom these men are encouraging everyone to read, right? And so I think I second their advice. Read the reformers. But I would go further and I would say, the method of the reformers, in large part, I don't agree with everything the reformers did or said or wrote, but their methodology is pretty good. And their reading is pretty good. Because they're reading, they're not saying, well, just because this person or that person comes from this particular background, we're not going to read them. We're not going to read them and drink from them deeply. In fact, they did drink from them deeply. This is just, this is, I think, pretty obvious when you read the Institutes that indeed there was some reception going on, not only from Greek pagans, but obviously from Roman Catholics, medieval Roman Catholics, and then Roman Catholics going back to the time of Augustine. The other thing that was said was when Owen Strahan in the video, talked about, not reading. He's talking about not reading so much from the RCs, and reading more from the reformers. What we have to remember here is that God's truth is God's truth, right? And so if you have someone like Thomas Aquinas utter a true proposition, that proposition is not original to Aquinas. That's God's truth. And so we're responsible at that point for appropriating that truth to within our own theology, if it's true, right? If it's true, it must be appropriated. It must be taken into consideration. It must be believed. If it's true, it must be believed, right? And all of these artificial things that we could put between us and that truth needs to be done away with. You could say, don't read Aquinas, that's soul damaging. You could say that all you want, but the reality is you're shutting yourself off from potentially a useful resource, and a useful articulation in many areas of Christian orthodoxy, of Christian theology. And I think when you get into this whole thing of we need to deny these doctrines that came from Aquinas or that we think came from Aquinas because these doctrines are influenced by a synthesis with Aristotelianism or something like that, or Dionysius or something like that, then what you end up doing is you actually end up dashing to pieces orthodox doctrines like pure actuality in God, which is something that Dr. Johnson rejected overtly in his book. Do I think that if you articulated pure actuality in other terms, Johnson would necessarily reject it? I can't say for certain, but I would imagine that in substance, Dr. Johnson would probably affirm actus purus. In some ways, whenever you say God is immutable, you are affirming actus purus in God. And so maybe the terminology is getting in the way. But there are some other things that Dr. Johnson said in his book that would maybe bring that cohesiveness into question. When he affirms movement in God and so on and so forth. I think there are a lot of things to be talked about with Dr. Johnson and Dr. Strahan and Dr. White. I think this conversation should keep going, but I should, with one caveat, it needs to keep going. It actually needs to improve in some ways, and the key way that it needs to improve is that it needs to be more two-way. It seems like there's a lot of content being produced on our side, there's a lot of content being produced on their side, but there's not a whole lot of talking to one another. To my knowledge, there hasn't been any debates scheduled. There hasn't been any roundtable discussions scheduled. There's a pretty big wall of separation right now between, these two sides, and the conversation hasn't really been two-way between the two sides. It's been one way for both sides, right? I'm producing a video right now, but I don't have James White in here, conversing with me. I don't have Owen Strahan in here conversing with me, or Jeff Johnson, and so I'm producing a one-way take here, which is helpful. It can be helpful, I think, but the ideal would be in a conversation like this, it's so important, it's a doctrine of God after all, would be to have a two-way, line of communication going on here, and I just haven't seen that. When it happens, it's going to be good. When it happens, it's going to be good, if it happens, okay? So that's my prayer, it's my hope. Now, what I want to say to the whole claim that, Dr. James White is saying that implying at least that it's soul damaging or could be soul damaging to read someone like Aquinas. I think that totally misses the mark as to what constitutes soul damage. I don't think reading wrong things is soul damaging. So if your assumption is that Aquinas was wrong about everything, does that necessarily mean it's soul damaging to read that? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, there are a lot of things in the scriptures that are presented to us that are terrible things, right? Like, and I'm talking about the activities of the pagan nations and the kind of worship that they offered to the Baals and the kind of sacrifices that they, just grotesque things that are described, the adultery that's described in Scripture. But of course, you don't say, well, when you read about Solomon's many wives or David's affair with Bathsheba, that's really soul-destroying. No, it's not soul-destroying. It really happened historically, and God has, inspired His words such that those stories, those historical accounts are preserved in all their integrity. And they're preserved for a purpose, all right? And you read those stories for a reason, right? They're pointing to something. Man's desperation for the grace of God in Christ and in Christ alone, for one. I mean, that's one thing that we could say, that these stories really look to. Man's failure of the glory of God, of the law of God, and falling short of God's majesty and glory, and our desperate need for reconciliation to Him through the blood and righteousness of Jesus Christ. That's a major thing that a lot of the sin that you see in the Old Testament is pointing to. The other thing is the judgment of God that the pagan nations store up for themselves, right? And so there needs to be a thoroughgoing account of those things so that we can understand the more glorious and the good things, having them contextualized by some of those grotesque things that happen, so that we can know that God is holy, so that we can know that we're desperate for a Savior, and so on and so forth, right? So there's reading of bad things, less than ideal things in the Scriptures that are recorded perfectly and infallibly, without error, which we read for a more glorious purpose, right? So we're not reading those things as an end in themselves. Likewise, whether Aquinas is right or wrong, nobody reads Aquinas. If you're reading Aquinas as an end in himself, like if you're making Aquinas the object of your study and studiousness and the object of your trust and your faith and your hope and your interest and your happiness and safety, well then obviously that's soul destroying. That's going to be soul destroying. But that's going to be that kind of posture taken toward any author is going to be soul destroying. It doesn't matter who it is, right? It doesn't matter who it is. And so, if you're reading Aquinas in view, your goal is to learn the truth and to learn both what to do and how to think, and then also what not to do and how not to think, right? I think you can read Aquinas and benefit in both of those areas, because I think there are things that Aquinas gets right, there are things that Aquinas gets wrong. And so I think we can read him and people like him, not just him, but Duns Scotus, Occam, these other guys that we would have strong disagreements with, that nevertheless probably got some things right. And so we should read them. We should read them. Especially someone as influential as Aquinas, because he's not only influential on the Council of Trent, which is always the claim that's made in order to, I think, darken, countenance concerning Aquinas and his work. But in reality, Aquinas contextualized the first generation, the second generation, and the post-Reformation theologians. There's a great deal of reception, a great deal of osmosis going on between Aquinas and the Reformers and the post-Reformed. That's just the reality. Is everything accepted? Obviously not. Obviously not. But there is some talking going on there, and some positive talking going on there, I would say, to varying degrees, depending on who you're looking at. The first generation of Reformers, not as much as the second generation and the post-Reformation. So, with that said, just to revisit, the two claims are, the implication is, it's soul damaging or potentially soul destroying to read Aquinas, the question I would ask is why? Right? How are you reading Aquinas? That's what's going to determine whether or not reading Aquinas is soul destroying, right? And then that's not following the method of the reformers, right? The reformers read unbelievers consistently, yearly, right, weekly, and obviously didn't consider it a sin or a soul destroying thing to do so. Look here, if it's soul destroying, it's sin, right? That's what destroys the soul. So by saying something like that, you're essentially saying it's sinful to read Aquinas. So we've got to be consistent here, brothers and sisters. And the second claim, of course, by Strahan is that, we should be drinking deeply of our own. Don't go, pre 1517 or whatever into Roman Catholic world, because, that's okay. The same implication there is that that's dangerous. That's a negative trend in this movement of ressourcement. And, to which I just say, I ask the question, who were the reformers reading? Who were the reformers reading? And you might say, well, they were reading Augustine. Well, they weren't only reading Augustine, but also Augustine is like the chief progenitor of Mariology in the Roman Catholic Church, right? So if they can read Augustine and benefit from Augustine, but at the same time refuse to accept and receive his Mariology, then we can read someone like Aquinas and, take the good and then refuse to receive, things like sacerdotalism. We can refuse to receive and reject with discernment, his Mariology and meritorious grace and all of this, right? So just drink deeply from many sources. It's like Spurgeon said. He said, visit many books, but live in the Bible. And that's true. Spurgeon also read a great deal of Roman Catholic scholars, and he even lent credence to the possibility that many of them were true believers because they were inconsistent with a lot of, Romish policies in some cases. You go back to the earlier popes, and you have, Gregory the Great, for example, condemns the idea of a universal bishop. I think Gregory the Great was probably a Christian. Roman Catholicism claims him, and he looks like a Roman Catholic in a lot of ways. But does he believe in the gospel? Does he believe, is he following men or is he following Christ? And I think what you get out of a reading of Gregory is he's desiring to follow Christ. He's not, the idea of a universal bishop seems to be repulsive to him. So, you got to read with discernment. Anyway, if this episode was helpful, thank you guys for listening. If it was helpful, please share it. Give me a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Again, check out the newsletter, joshsummer.substack.com. God bless you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day.